Back in 1981 is when it all started. How did it start?
Well, it started actually about 1980, kind of, when I was trying to build a recording studio and I needed some extra money. I said, I know what I'll do. My cousin was working at Jensen Transformer. We'll make an active direct box. So the original direct box used a monolithic FET, basically two FETs in series. It was okay, but I ought to say the only thing about the product I liked was the battery tester on it. And moving forward, I was always intrigued with tubes, and going back to the days when I worked at the hi-fi store. So I started reading the RCA tube manuals and noticed this circuit for a thing called a cathode follower. And I thought, that's interesting because that would work the direct box. So doing a little research, we eventually found found the proper transformers, and my friend Phil Van Allen helped me design the box. And we came out with the tube direct box. And due to a strange error, I forgot to put one resistor in the circuit, which was the loading resistor. So instead of being actually a classic cathode follower, it was actually the circuit one would use in a vacuum tube voltmeter. Not that anyone knows what one of those is anymore, but essentially had an infinite input impedance. And because of that, it would pick up high end from magnetic pickups like you've never heard before through a direct box, because it had a 27 million ohm input impedance. And it also had the advantage on, say, like a ceramic pickup of having bottom end you never heard before. And so that started me in the direct box business. And that same circuit, as it turned out, solved a few other problems too, particularly with preamps, because it had a low output impedance. I was fixing Leland Scalar's Olympic-based preamp and looked at the circuitry. I was dumbfounded the way they designed it, because it had a high output impedance. And I said, that was really weird. So I decided, well, I could probably build something a little better. And as time went on, it became the VT BP-201 that is the basis for almost every preamp I make to this day. It had the low output impedance you needed, and then because I could put the Jensen transformer in the circuit because it had that low output impedance, it had an amazing sounding direct output. And as time went on, the look of the preamp, of course, changed. I think you actually have one of the 1.5 rack styles, which I made until about 1992 or so. And then we went to the VT BP-201S, which is the single rack space version, although the basic circuit hasn't changed since 1982. We've made it the same way all those years. Because I guess the other evolutionary thing would be, of course, the how we finally made an amplifier after making, basically just preamps for around 20 years, I guess, or more than 20 years. Of course, you have an H series too, because the H series was my concept of putting a parametric equalizer, because although the 201S sounded great, it did have limited tone controls, and in some sonic environments it's nice to have a little more control. So we added the parametric equalizer and came out with the HPP1, which is the basis for later on we would put a power amp inside that, and an HPP1-800D, as well as the same thing we did, of course, for the 201, that we added a power amp in the single rack space units. Years ago, we did experiment with the Bass 600. And although it was a wonderful sounding amp, it was basically, of course, that would be in, like, what year was that?
2005.
Okay. In 2005, we experimented with trying to make an amplifier, the combo's not the right word. What's the word?
A head.
Yeah, trying to make an amplifier head. And we came up with the Bass 600. And it was a semi-successful product, but the 300 watts at 8 ohms was really not enough power anymore. It wasn't modern enough. We wanted to use an FET amplifier, and although it sounded wonderful, When it broke up, it sounded scary, and so we decided maybe it wasn't going to be a product that we were completely happy with. So we spent the next 5 or 6 years trying to come up with a much more powerful version. Eventually, we spent a lot of money in R&D and development and came up with this 1,000-watt amplifier that was a Class H amplifier. It sounded amazingly good. Its downside was it was very expensive and weighed about 40 pounds. After an amp show where we had premiered that amplifier, the salesman from the ICE Power Module company came to visit our booth and said, "I might have something for you." And he showed me these little modules that had quite a lot of power that would actually fit in a single rack space. And so we decided we'd experiment with them. So after experimenting with them and comparing, we decided that yes, maybe the other amp sounded a tiny bit better, but it certainly wasn't, $800 better and 32 pounds better. So we decided we would research how to best couple these amplifiers, which eventually came up with the using a special Jensen transformer to drive them. So it was like a classic tube amplifier with a tube and a transformer actually generating the signal to the power amp. So the power amp, being very neutral, just picked up this tube transformer sound, and you got a really very natural sounding bass amp. At the same time this was going on, Leland Sklar decided he was going to give me a present. Bass preamps number 1 and 3 were sent back to us. He had used them for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, and retired them about 5 or 6 years ago and was doing nothing with them. So he decided they should go back to the guy that invented them. So he sent them to us, and of course we plugged them in, and they all work still, even though they were now 30 some odd years old. And we said, this is a nice sounding thing. At the same time, we were thinking about maybe making a little amp head, and this just seems like a natural. And the final factor in coming out with the original amp head was the fact that we had 200 of those circuit boards sitting up in storage. So we had the original Leland Sklar circuit boards, so we decided, let's see how small an amp head we can make using these things. And that is where the VT BP-M800D came from, and that is where eventually the Bass 800 came from too, because we just kept on experimenting, trying to make things work better and better. So the amp here is a TGA 2.1. It evolved originally from the TGA 3, which was the 3-channel guitar amplifier, which was pretty much very ahead of its time. I designed that in, I think, 1985. And it was the only 3-channel amplifier on the market. And we sold, quite a few of them. It was an unusual amp that it had a Class A output section, or actually, to be more accurate, it'd be called an ultralinear output system, which made it very high fidelity, which gave it an amazing sounding clean channel that broke up really beautifully, which is probably why it was Bonnie Raitt's favorite amplifier for like 20 years. It evolved over the years to eventually become the TGA 2.1. Actually, it became the TGA 2 and then the TGA 2.1, so we could make something a little smaller and a little less expensive, and also pure mono, because the TGA 3 could actually be run in stereo, which back in the days of racks was quite the thing to do, but these days, it's not particularly popular. We offer the TGA 2.1 with 4 different power amp sections now. From a 22-watt Class A to a 50-watt Class AB to a 75-watt Class A again, and finally a 100. Oh, actually, there's 5. There's a 100-watt Class AB and there's a 120-watt Class A. This particular amp you have here is actually the 120-watt Class A. I think we've only made 3 of them, and they sound pretty bloody amazing. And eventually, of course, that evolved too to the TGA 1, or the Mighty Mini that Sonny Landreth plays. When he can't take his TGA 3, he takes his TGA 2.1, and because cartage being what it is these days, he's using the TGA one almost all the time. And he is the one who actually named it the Mighty Mini. And so that's pretty much the whole guitar line real quick.
Can you tell us a little bit about the cabinet that we're using today?
Yeah, it's a closed back 2x12 cabinet. We have two Jensen Jet speakers in there. They sound very much like a Celestion built on a Wednesday with no hangovers. The TGP3 is still being used by Dean DeLeo and said it probably is the signature STP sound, using the TGP3 preamp with a power amplifier. And it's also used by Doyle of the Misfits, and Trent Reznor used it for his keyboards for a lot of different things because he loved the distortion of it. And it was also used by Clint Black and Clint Black's guitar player and a bunch of other Nashville cats that used that preamp with a power amp for their sound. Oh, Warren Haynes too also used it. He used it when he was doing the Allman Brothers. During the Allman Brothers period, he was using the TGA3.